So after the Zygon inversion was a pretty shit part 1 to this Zygon story, it's safe to say that I'm more than a little worried for reviewing the Zygon inversion, because while beforehand I'd seen a few problems with the Zygon invasion, the second I started analysing it, it almost completely fell apart. But if my memory serves me correctly, the Zygon inversion is a fucking massive step up in quality from what came beforehand, with the good bits of setup from the previous part being fleshed out and expanded upon, making the Zygon inversion an absolute masterpiece in comparison. But considering the fact I was so wrong about the Zygon invasion at first, am I wrong about this episode's quality? Is it actually any good at all? Or is it just another disappointment to add to the 12th Doctor's ever-growing list of bad episodes? Let's find out. The episode starts out in a really visually interesting dream space, where actual Clara is currently, and I really like what the production team did with the set design of Clara's house, because it's the same set as before, but they slightly alter things to show us that something isn't quite right, which we obviously know, but this acts as a way of showing Clara what's changed. And the charcoal toothpaste with the label "This is toothpaste" was pretty funny, I'm not gonna lie. And I like the detail that the second Clara figures out there's something wrong, she starts doing dream checks. I would like to say this shows how far her character has come, but her character literally goes from doctor-like but treat like a good thing, to a relatively normal person with a few negative Doctor traits seeping through, to being that obsessed with the Doctor to the point where it leads to a downfall. So instead, I'll say it's good for this version of Clara. This is a good way of showing the obsession arc this series was going for. However, I must say my first proper complaint with this episode arrives when Clara is trying to stop Bonnie from blowing up the plane, because she does a really shitty job trying to defend him. She does that thing that loads of TV shows and films do when someone is going against another stronger opponent, and they do a thing that clearly helps their case a little bit, but then they don't do it again. This isn't the exact same thing, but it's the only example I could think of. But it's like how Loki in Avengers constantly uses his magic and his illusions to his advantage, and it's shown to be super useful and super effective several times. But then in his own show, even while not in the TVA, where the magic doesn't work because it doesn't, he just doesn't use his magic in any effective ways because he's a fucking incompetent, pathetic idiot in his own show. One thing I do commend this episode for, similarly to how even the last episode did well sometimes, is the world building in some scenes. Because right off the bat we see someone sweeping away some of the electric hair remains of the humans. It sounds goofy, but it surprisingly isn't, and the episode always plays them seriously. And we see that almost everyone is a Zygon, and their symbol is everywhere, and I appreciate the set designers and production crew absolutely stepping their game up from last episode immensely. And I like how we get a little subversion when we see that Bonnie was actually chasing down another Zygon and forcing him back into his normal form to expose him to the world as part of her fucked up plan to start a war. And one thing I do commend about this story is that it goes into the body horror elements of the Zygons a lot more than any other story has before, and it works really effectively at solidifying this story's dark tone. However, one thing that detracts from this is the effect of the humans transforming into the Zygons and vice versa. This effect only really looked good in the 50th because that story obviously had a much increased budget than before, and we get to see a sort of mix between the two and then a natural change into the Zygon, which looks fucking horrific and portrays the monster perfectly. However, with this story, due to Series 9's obviously rushed production, and this story obviously not being as expensive as the 50th, the effects look super rushed and unrealistic, because there's no mid-period between the two where you can see the transformation. I get that the point of this one was supposed to show that this guy had no, control over this, and he had the human form stripped away from him. But you could have made it so you could see him struggling to try and keep his tall Danny DeVito head body, and sort of have a confliction shown between the two forms, sort of like Hulk in Infinity War. Because otherwise this just looks kinda goofy.
Don't look at my browser history.
Well.
Yeah, I said don't.
I almost just passed out from laughing, I'm not even kidding.
Wait a minute. How are we gonna...
Pretty cringe.
Pretty cringe.
Osgood then proves herself to be a believer in objective criticism when she points out the Doctor's character traits and why the villains of this show will never win because they let him talk. Which is why John Sim is the best master, just saying. Tough! And I think that pointing out these cliches is honestly just a detriment to some of the show's shittier done stories, because it just points out how bad they can be. Because it's obviously an essential part of the show that the Doctor more or less always wins, but it's how the Doctor wins is what makes the show so interesting to watch. Take for example the two previous stories I reviewed, Under the Lake and Before the Flood, have the Doctor win in a really interesting way, and you genuinely believe at times that he could lose because of some great stakes set up in that story, that have been really well established throughout with the great villains and a great plot, making that a super engaging story. But The Girl Who Died and The Woman Who Lived, a much worse story, where the story feels like it has zero tension, zero stakes, because they are set so low and the villains of both these episodes are horribly established that you never really feel any tension at all. Not that a story needs tension to be good, because there's plenty low stakes stories that pointing out flaws in a story or a show as a whole wouldn't be bad if you act upon these flaws and try and fix them. But Moffat himself and Peter Hardis have both done this cliche before and after this story. So honestly, I think the inclusion of this line is pretty bad overall. Especially the moment where she points out he went silent because of Clara. Like, seriously, could you not let Capaldi's brilliant acting have told us that on its own? It's like how in The Office they acknowledge that Kevin's became more of a retard and then they just continue making him more of a retard and never explain why. Clara then proves herself to be a bitch with over 1 million snap score by being able to type out a message to the Doctor perfectly by guessing where the letters are. Fucking hell. Not only is this a super contrived way of moving the plot along and showing the Doctor that Clara's alive, it's also just pretty fucking stupid. Like, bro, I've owned phones for over 6 years at this point, and there's no fucking way I could do this. Like, at least add in some spelling mistakes or something. That could have actually been funny as well. And as much as I tolerate Osgood as a character, don't you think this is the sort of thing that the Doctor would figure out, and not the temporary companion? Like, I get that she's a fan of him and will know his past adventures, but he fucking lived them. He should know this shit better than anyone. After every ghost or possession cliche ever is shown, we see how smart Osgood is again by completely bamboozling Bonnie by tricking her into not knowing where the Osgood box is, which is a pretty great scene, and seeing Jenna Coleman actually get to show some range with her acting, which it seems like hasn't happened in forever, was great. Unfortunately, we then get another really shitty scenes with the retarded Zygons doing a horrible job of blending in. And then for some reason, when the Doctor and Osgood are escaping, they decide to turn the car around, then get out of the car and slowly walk towards them. Sorry, what the fuck are you doing? If you wanted to catch up with them, why would you not use the car, you short-sighted corned beef? Also, why is the Doctor being such a dumbass in this scene? Why point out that Bonnie is blinking when you know that Clara is alive and can control Bonnie somewhat? I do like, however, that the Doctor thought far enough ahead to basically trick Bonnie into the room with the Osgood boxes so that he can convince her to be a good person later on. Because he can tell that she's clearly a young idiot who hasn't experienced war properly and just assumes that it'll solve everything. Well, it's either that or the Doctor really overestimates Clara. Which, if that's the case, also works well for showing a bit of his side of the obsession arc by overestimating what a normal person should be capable of. Either that, or the writers really oversighted this. I'll let you choose.
I don't think I've ever seen you smile before.
Dazzling, isn't it?
You're goddamn right.
Bonnie then confronts Clara in the pod, and I'm glad that this interaction actually shows us Clara being threatened in a way that she seems like she could be in danger for once. Because one of the unfortunate downsides of the obsession arc is, because of Clara's Doctor-like nature, she never really feels like she's in harm's way a lot of the time. Because she just gets away with a lot of the actions she does because she's good at it. And when Clara has this much plot immunity, it's understandable why so many people can see her character as boring, because fucking hell, sometimes I do. I get that the point in Face the Raven was that Clara pushed her luck far too many times and it results in her death. But even Rose faced more repercussions for her Doctor-like attitude in Series 2, a lot more than Clara did. So this scene works well as showing us that Clara is meant to be a human being, with vulnerabilities. And I really like how the scene puts her down a peg, because Bonnie absolutely destroys her in this scene, seen through all of her usual tricks, like avoiding the question and not being specific with certain details. It's a really great scene. However, it is really strange that despite the beginning of the scene showing us that it's impossible for Clara to turn off the TV, she then just can.
London. What a dump.
I fucking love 12, man. Capaldi is just so good in this role. He seriously deserves better material for a large portion of his run. So the Doctor and Worst Malcolm track down the Danny DeVito head Zygon from the opening of the episode. In between that, we get a pretty funny moment where they exchange first names, and the Doctor's is a type of spice,
Basil.
and Osgood sounds like something you contract from eating a raw fish.
Petronella.
But when we find DeVito, we get a really interesting scene which shows us the confliction of the average Zygon and what they think of Bonnie trying to start a war. And they keep up the body horror element this episode set up earlier really well, with the horrible squelching sounds and his face moulding, really making this scene uncomfortable to watch, but not in a bad way. The scene gets super interesting when he kills himself because of how this war has ruined his life. It's a really eye-opening perspective for the story, because he even points out the Doctor's hypocrisy in trying to convince him they're on the same side. Because he's not on anyone's side. He just wanted to live his life on Earth, because it was his home and it made him happy. A truly fantastic scene. My only real gripe with it is that DeVito strikes the Doctor with his Zygon lightning twice, and it doesn't really do anything. So Bonnie arrives at the Osgood boxes, which is a really nice little trick in the episode, by the way. And it actually does make sense. Then we get shown that Kate survives against the Zygon in the Breaking Bad flashback, and I do like that the episode left it up till nearly the 30-minute mark before telling us whether Kate is human or Zygon, because the obvious presumption would be that she's a Zygon because of how Kate's been acting. And I do like that the story also sets up how while Bonnie is intelligent, she isn't as smart as she thinks she is, because she just assumes that the Zygon won over Kate in the flashback, which shows obvious hypocrisy in her plan, because what her plan is to unmask all the Zygons and start out a war to show that humans are better than Zygons. But this scene itself shows the hypocrisy in that, because she automatically assumed that the Zygon was superior, but she's the one who wants super equality. A detail that, as you probably noticed, I hadn't even picked up on until I started recording the review. Then we get more build up to the Doctor hating war, and even a little hint that the Doctor's already got some sort of way to figure out how to stop this war breaking out by saying Kate had agreed on the safeguarding but the Doctor had wiped her memory of her agreeing. Which is a nice little detail to notice on rewatches of the story. Then we get the scene. The ever so sacred, beautiful scene where the Doctor stops both sides from starting a war, not by fighting them, but words. His words stop the war, and it's absolutely fucking pristine. I love it how the Doctor starts off by belittling both sides, by speaking in a cheesy accent before this facade cracks, and we see how much truly both sides have pissed him off because of their heinous actions. The lines about how it not being fair don't matter, and Bonnie breeding new cruel people are absolutely fucking brilliant. Sending the message to the audience that revenge on the people who've wronged you is futile, because in the end, you're just as bad as them, and you could end up doing things much, much worse in the end. And the look on Capaldi's face when he realizes that Bonnie doesn't even know what she wants, and is basically just throwing a fucking tantrum, is amazing. As of yet, this is Capaldi's best acting in the role of the Doctor. He conveys so much disappointment, anger, yet sympathy and care just in this one shot. He is truly amazing here. The Doctor's compassion shown in this scene, despite the stupid actions of Bonnie and Kate, are fucking brilliant. And this is probably the best showcase of one of the Doctor's key character traits. And I like how as he sees it's failing, he starts doing his cheesy accent again, to make them realise how childish they're both behaving. And the part where he talks about how starting the war is always wrong, because it'll just lead to more death and more destruction than you could ever imagine, was fucking excellent, and shows the Doctor's own knowledge of war amazingly. One of my biggest gripes with Moffat's era as a whole is its treatment of the Time War and the Time Lords, but my issue of the Time War barely being mentioned and acknowledged, and the Doctor seemingly not learning from his mistakes in the war, are thrown right out of the window in the speech, and it's absolutely fucking astonishing. It is that good I am losing the ability to England right now. And nothing more exemplifies that fact than when the Doctor directly talks about the Time War and how it directly affects him on a day-to-day basis.
And when I close my eyes, I hear more screams than anyone could ever be able to count.
And it's made even better by the fact that because the Doctor, despite being a great person, had to do the most horrible deed ever, he knows how much it affects the little people, and he'll never let it happen again to anyone on his watch, which is just so perfect for what the Doctor as a character has meant in the revival. And considering the quality of this story, I've just got to say, where the fuck did all of this come from? Seriously, the first part of this story was so bad, and this part has just been okay at best, with bits of great quality seen throughout, and now we are genuinely getting one of the best scenes this show has ever seen. What the fuck happened? And I love the little moment when the Doctor forgives Kate and she apologizes. It's such a great way of showing how even the best of people can be corrupted by the idea of war, but when reminded of humanity, they can then strive to do better. It's so great. That entire sequence of the Doctor converting Bonnie into a good person to the point where he can trust her to not do it again and protect the planet with Osgood and understand that war is pointless is absolutely fucking amazing. However, the one thing I really don't like about the ending of that whole scene is the Doctor saying that it was Clara who convinced him to save the Time Lords. I have a shit ton of issues with the Doctor saving the Time Lords and Dave the Doctor itself, which I'll probably just say in a review in the very, very, very distant future. So, for now, I'm just gonna say, why didn't the Doctor just say something like, he made that mistake before and he's lived to regret it every single waking moment for over 1,000 years. That's a lot more impactful than just another bonking over the head of reminding us of how fucking great and how obsessed the Doctor is with Clara. And I do like that we don't get a definitive answer on whether this version of Osgood is human or Zygon. It's a really good note to end this story on after that amazing sequence. What a fantastic way to end the story. Except for another fucking obsession arc scene, and I'm not gonna lie, this is one of the few ones that I just don't like, because it feels so tacked on, and the scene of the Osgoods walking away was a much better way to end the story instead of another reminder that the Doctor and Clara are too obsessed with each other. So, that was the Zygon inversion, or in my head canon, Truth or Consequences, and this part was a massive step up from the last part of the story, but there's still quite a lot of stupid and contrived moments in the story. The story's lack of Clara I think actually works in its benefit, because the few scenes revolving around actual Clara are some of the worst in this story. The Zygons that aren't main characters remain fucking idiots for no real reason. I don't really think Osgood has enough of a character to really bounce off the Doctor in a super interesting way, and there's a couple nitpicks and contrived moments throughout. However, unlike with a lot of other stories in this series that I've reviewed, they can't really detract from the amazing elements of this story. The world building is fantastic, the threat of the Zygons is really well portrayed, and the confliction of war is shown off in a really interesting way throughout, keeping up some of the great body horror elements from before. Kate is great in this episode. This is a way of portraying someone who's about to start war in a reasonable way without making the character an idiot or short-sighted to contrive a plot. And her character is shown at her best when she says sorry at the end. And Bonnie is a pretty great villain. Her confliction and eventual turn into the idea of war is shown in a very good way by having her motivations not be evil for the sake of being evil, but being the oppressed person becoming the oppressor, making the character who's seemingly fucking evil pretty sympathetic by the end because of the Doctor's amazing speech. Bonnie is probably one of the best villains in Capaldi's era, and definitely one of the highlights of Series 9. And it's funny because she's only really featured for one full part, but is better than Ashilda in all 4 of her fucking stories. Bonnie is how you do a sympathetic villain properly, not Ashilda. Fuck that bitch. And loosely speaking of the Doctor, Peter Capaldi gives us his best performance as the Doctor yet, in the absolutely amazing scene, which shows us some of the most interesting character traits and dynamics of the Doctor that we have not explored, seemingly since the 10th Doctor is interestingly at least, making this episode overall, it's alright. Nowhere near as bad as the Ishilda Power, not as bad as the Dalek series opener, not as bad as the Zygon Invasion, but not as good as Under the Lake, and only slightly, well, I say slightly, quite a bit worse than Before the Flood. Because this episode still has a lot of problems, but overall, I'd say it's a pretty positive episode. Unfortunately, I won't be saying that about the next review, because up next is fucking Sleep No More, and if the reviews aren't out by this year, I'm fully going to blame this fucking episode alone, because holy shit! Keeping up some of the great body horror elements, keeping